Hi, this is Korean Choices in Criminology, a vodcast describing the life stories of prominent scholars in criminology, created by Network Safe Places at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology. We would like to gain insights into their professional journeys, the factors and motivations behind their entry into the field of criminology, and their career accomplishments. We hope these interviews can serve as a source of inspiration for you who is a student or early career scholar. During these interviews, we aim to discover their past and present research passions. If you have comments or suggestions, please contact us via our website. Thank you and enjoy.
Hi, my name is Vânia Secato. I am a researcher at the KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden. It's a pleasure for me to introduce you to today's speaker or today's guest, Professor Prof. Brantingham from Simon Fraser University here in Vancouver. Hi.
Hi.
Professor Paul, how are you doing?
Good. And Paul, just call me Paul. Professor Paul is a little too
Okay.
formal. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for taking time to talk to us. And before we start, can you tell us briefly what's your name and when and where you were born, and a little bit of your past before you start your career?
Yes, my name is Paul Brantingham. I was born in Long Beach, California, in the United States a long time ago. I grew up through high school in California and then went to Columbia University, where I met my wife, Pat, again, a long time ago. I originally went to Columbia thinking I would do journalism. I became very interested in study of government, and was thinking about a career in civil service. And I went to the law school at Columbia after graduating from the undergraduate program, and found that I was very interested in criminal law and criminal procedure, and took a seminar with Leon Radzinowitz, who was the professor at Cambridge at the time. And that got me hooked on criminology. Then I was able to get a Ford Fellowship that took me to Cambridge, a program that was trying to retread young lawyers as criminologists. And it was then called the diploma course. It was a one-year course. It's now called the MPhil, exactly the same requirements, including a thesis. That is now the MPhil, but in those olden times, it was called the Postgraduate Diploma in Criminology.
I see.
And I then, coming back to the States, I landed a job with Vern Fox's criminology program at the Florida State University in Tallahassee, and I was there for 7 years. During that time, Pat took her second master's in urban planning and her doctorate in urban planning, and we got interested in how what she knew from urban planning and the problems I was looking at in crime control could fit together. And we started collaborating. We helped set up a joint program between the urban planning and criminology schools, and that ran for several years and produced people at the master's level came out effectively in a 3-year program with 2 master's degrees, one in criminology and one in urban planning.
This was which university?
This was at Florida State.
Florida State. Okay.
Yes. And as we got that going, and about the time Pat finished her PhD, we were recruited by Simon Fraser.
Okay.
And came as a couple to Greater Vancouver, to Simon Fraser.
So you you have your background in law. How and you told me a little bit on I don't know what initially sparked your interest in criminology. But I'm wondering how was the process of becoming a criminologist, an environmental criminologist? How did you?
We sort of jointly moved together. And I was very interested from early on in how you could use public published police statistics to try to understand the criminal events. And discovered that there was really not very much understanding in the dynamics or the activities involved in moving from wherever you were sitting to where you committed a crime. And so I got interested in looking at that issue and discovered that there'd been a lot of really interesting work done in human geography. So having trained as a lawyer, as a political scientist, and then being recredited as a criminologist, but the program was heavily, at Cambridge, had been heavily focused on administration of justice at the time, penology. And my own tutor was Donald West, who was a psychiatrist. Nobody had looked at where crimes were occurring to any extent, and so we got interested in that, and we came at it, the two of us, from slightly different directions. But I was interested in understanding where within a city crimes were occurring, where they were concentrating, and we started mapping those and looking at the literature that was available then. We began to, Pat and I, look at whether you could produce some general theory that would consistently predict the patterns you would find in different cities and in different places within cities. And we thought that we came up with some stuff. So we went from being interested in where crimes were occurring as part of the criminal event process to looking for ways to theoretically describe or model persistent patterns in crime. And that's how I got into environmental criminology. Now, we actually, by that time, knew Ron Clark and Patricia Mayhew and the work they were doing in defining crime prevention. At the same time, while I was at Tallahassee, the next door neighbor, man in the next office, was Ray Jeffrey, C. Ray Jeffrey, who wrote the book Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And he, as a young scholar, he sort of took me under his wing, and we spent a lot of time talking back and forth over coffee and through lunches about things. And his view of CPTED was much broader than what it's become. It wasn't simply managing architecture and streetscapes. It was also managing social relations and social events and understanding how the two things fit together. And so I had that in my background as Pat and I started thinking about things. And then we had also come across Marcus and the things he was talking about in terms of routine activities. And we began to ask, how can we fit all of those things together and find a way for describing what overarched? And so we thought, what we're really looking at is the environment that surrounds crime, the physical environment and the social environment that surrounds criminal events. Let's call it environmental criminology, to separate it out from trying to understand the psychology of why people would want to steal a fancy car, or the sociology of why some neighborhoods have more crime than others. And so at the American Society of Criminology meetings in Atlanta, and I think it was 76 or 77, we organized a panel that had all of those names I just mentioned together. And Pat and I stood up and said, we're going to call this field environmental criminology until somebody comes up with a better term. And that's where the term came from and was applied in the first, to sort of overarch from crime prevention through environmental design to routine activity theory to the spatial patterns of crime to the geometry of crime to the patterns of crime.
Oh, interesting. You mentioned Jeffrey. Jeffrey was a criminologist, if I understood from the beginning.
He was from the outset. He was Sutherland's last student.
Okay. I see.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So he was an interesting man in that way.
There was a parallel development in architecture, which obviously had similar roots from same ideas with Jeffrey, like Jenny Jacobs. With obviously she was not a criminologist. She was actually also a journalist that wrote about urban planning. In some of those ideas were similar.
Well, let me tell you a little story that I got from Ray Jeffrey about that.
Okay.
Before moving to Florida State, Ray Jeffrey had been at New York University, NYU, and he was actually not in the same department, but he and Oscar Newman were both on the same floor because their departments shared space. And they were each separately working on their approaches to environmental criminology, and they didn't know each other.
Amazing. Yeah.
And they both knew Jane Jacobs.
Yes. And
talked about it. And Jeffrey, as a matter of fact, lived on Bleecker Street.
Yeah.
So he was sort of intimately familiar with the territory that Jane Jacobs was talking about.
Yeah.
So that was sort of part of where he was coming from in getting into things. The other thing is that the original proposed title for Newman's book was Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design.
Oh, I see.
A defensible space, Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. But Jeffrey's book, Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design, came out before Newman's book by 6 months or something. And so Newman had to change his to Crime Prevention Through Urban Design as the subtitle to Defensible Space.
Oh, that's interesting. That is interesting. And I mean, now the obviously the field is quite interdisciplinary, but the roots are still there. And architects normally make reference to Jenny Jacobs and Newman, and rarely about Jeffrey. So it's interesting, but the field is pretty much, I would say, the same. Situational crime prevention came also along with same lines, but a little, if understood correct, a little bit wider scope, including even the work of policing, which obviously were not the focus on the work done by Jeffrey and for instance, Oscar Newman. Can you tell me a little bit about of this development of situational crime prevention and from what you can interpret from it?
Well, Ron Clark is better at telling this, I guess. But from my perspective, situational crime prevention came out of two things. One, the first, as I understand it, is that Ron, working as a psychologist with troubled kids, became disenchanted with the kinds of results he was getting if the measure that you were looking for was they're doing less crime. And so he started looking around for things while he was at the Home Office. And one of the things he came across was this discussion that was going on, Jeffrey stuff and Newman stuff, but I think Ron was more impacted by Newman. Newman's stuff is more visual, amongst other things. And situational prevention came out of the various kinds of experiments the Home Office then tried in small local locations to implement some kind of crime prevention through environmental design. And Ron was working with his colleagues, to build a more general structure that could be used in many locations in a generalized way. Yep. And then our crime pattern theory flowed from that, because what we tried to do was put together the work we'd been doing on geometry of crime and the movement of offenders to the criminal events with Marcus's observations on routine activities and Ron's work on situational prevention. How do they fit together, and what more general framework can you define? And that's what we tried to do in the first iteration of pattern theory.
Mm-hmm. Your experience also involve criminology in practice. Maybe you could tell a little bit of your experience during your career also outside academia.
I have to tell you, I'm basically I'm now retired. I was a licensed lawyer in California, but not much practice. I'm really an academic. Mm-hmm. The one exception to that is during the 1980s, after we had come to Simon Fraser, Pat and I were asked to come by the Justice Department to come to Ottawa and conduct an evaluation of the entire litigation section of the Department of Justice, the part that handles federal level criminal cases and all of the civil litigation and all of the civil advisement or legal advisement that goes to the various departments of government in the Canadian federal government. We did that for 2 years, and then they asked Pat if she would stay on for 2 more. We took a leave of absence from Simon Fraser, and they asked Pat if she would stay on for a couple of years to run the evaluation part of the Department of Justice. And I got invited to become the Director of Evaluation at the Public Service Commission of Canada, which is the agency that does the hiring and firing of civil servants. So we did that for a couple of years, and then began a transition back towards SFU, but that happened over an additional 2 years so that our son could stay and finish high school in Ottawa.
How do you see the role of the interaction between academia and practice today, or the role of criminologists in society?
Could be much better. There are 2 or 3 problems in the fit together. Most criminal justice agencies have an immediate need to address immediate kinds of problems. So they tend to want little quick studies that address something in a very material, immediate way. Most academics want to do something that goes beyond that. And they have a lot of trouble communicating back and forth. Academics, we've found over time that if you're willing to, as an academic, do some of those short studies to help, say, police or other government agencies, then they become much more open to expanding out, allowing you to take the same information sometimes and put it together to look at broader, more effective issues that often can feed back into better work. An example, our geometry of crime models got turned around by a graduate student, longtime professor named Kim Rossmo, who said, golly, if you can use your theory to predict where bad guys are going to go, if you know where they live, predict where they're likely to commit their crimes, maybe if we know where a crime has been committed, we can project backwards to where we might find
the offender.
Yeah, the offender. And that became geographic profiling. But in the intermediate part of it, Kim was able to use that approach to provide services to a series of policing agencies who had serial offender problems, and provide the service and give them a better handle on finding the bad guy. It doesn't pin down, geographic profiling doesn't find the offender for you. What the geographic profile does is suggest which possible suspects you should give priority to investigation to, which turns out to be one of the biggest problems in that kind of investigation, is narrowing the field of potentials rather than finding the guy by itself. It won't do that. And a lot of the stuff that academics produce operate at that level, where we find policing agencies or prosecutors' offices want you to find the one bad guy. They want you to do that. So there's a continual strain just because of the business of academics, which is to find broader patterns, and the needs of criminal justice agencies, which is to solve discrete problems. Yeah.
Well, I mean, criminology in society is generally changing over time. I mean, with technology and globalization, you have a number of challenges that are emergent every. How do you think that is going problems, and how are the kinds of problems that we are going to see more and more, let's say in 20 years' time? How do you think that's going to be?
I think it's going to be a big problem. Our largest crime growth areas, it seems to me, will have to do with the structure of networks of bad guys at one level, and the utilization of various kinds of networks, particularly computing networks and computing power, on the other hand. And right now, there is no part of the criminal justice apparatus in any country I'm aware of that really has people that are well trained to begin to address those issues. Moreover, criminology departments don't have many people who can do those. SFU is a good example. They have one professor who has a second PhD in computing science and addresses these issues. One professor out of 30. And they have 2 or 3 people like Martin Andreessen who are knowledgeable, but they see all of that as a tool for their own research rather than something that they've got to force their students to train in. And then when students go out equipped with that, finding an agency that's well suited to use that is a problem. And so I think criminology programs need to change to become more interdisciplinary in a genuine sense, not in a academic administrator's buzzword for sounding good, but in a genuine sense. And it may mean that university degrees are going to have to take longer because the amount of stuff that needs to be mastered is going to become more serious. people have to be, if they don't know mathematics, they have to know enough mathematics to know when it's time to go to the math department and find a colleague to work with. If they don't know urban planning, they need to know enough about urban design and geography to know when they need to go to the urban planning department or the geography department and find a colleague to work. And so that means they need to have at least introductory level knowledge in a lot of fields. Radzinowitz at Cambridge was one of the most remarkably unhumbled men I've come across. And he used to say that being a criminologist was really hard, that to be a criminologist, you had to have the complete mastery of the disciplines of law and sociology and psychology and medicine and geography. And then he would say, and I would argue that there's only one man in the world who now is a true criminologist. Modesty, of course, forbids me to pursue the topic further.
Yeah, it's definitely an area that demands the knowledge of many fields. And I guess it applies to many science, I guess, nowadays, because problems becomes much more complex than in the past. And I guess criminology is another field that demands that. If we consider, for instance, cybercrime, which obviously demand a number of other fields, as you mentioned, computer science and so on. I'm just wondering about, you just mentioned your career and your experience. We are approaching now the end of the interview. What advice would you give to yourself if you were 20 years old? Because many of our listeners are starting their careers, they are young or maybe young scholars. So it's a little bit of two questions here. How you would motivate them further in their, interested, and what you would say to yourself if you would be at the age of 20 with your career ahead. It's two parts of the same question.
For new young scholars, I would say, in addition to criminology, add in a minor in or field of study in some related things: computer science, urban planning, geography, mathematics, that are not commonly addressed in most criminology programs now, in any but the most cursory kind of ways, because I think that's where major new forms of crime are going to develop. Criminals have proven remarkably resilient and adaptive over time. And so the field needs to be remarkably adaptive. And that means learning new skills that are not readily available now. For myself, it would be go back and take those statistics courses I avoided. I found most of my friends at law school had done what I did. They had avoided statistics and mathematics, and that was a mistake.
So that would be your message to you if you were...
Yeah, go take that statistics course. You don't need another course in creative writing. Take the statistics course instead. That, to me, that would be advice I would give to my younger self.
Okay, great. So do you have any final words or thoughts or words that you would like to share with our viewers before we finish?
Yes, I think environmental criminology is one of the conceptual approaches to the future. It is a way to do good environmental criminology. You need to have people with diverse knowledge sets coming together. And I think that focusing on where things happen and how the elements of the crime came together at those locations remains one of those areas open to further research that will be really profitable both to academics and to the field.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Paul, for taking time to talk to us. It has been lovely to hear, to listen to your life story, your career, but also some specific, features of the story of Septet that I didn't know, which obviously I'm quite interested on the area. So it has been lovely to hear from you. To our viewers, thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for a new interesting interview in the future. Until then, take care and goodbye. Thank you.